Hey everybody, super excited to be here today. My name is David Arnoux. I'm not going to bore you with my lifelong story introduction. You can check me on LinkedIn. And today I want to introduce you to growth hacking in this 20-minute powerhouse session about growth hacking. I tend to speak quite fast, so just sort of brace yourself. So I was reading this book by Malcolm Gladwell called David versus Goliath. And in this book, Malcolm Gladwell talks about a political scientist called Aragon Toft. So what Aragon Toft did is that he summed up all of the wars over the past 200 years between like very large and very small armies. And he wanted to know what percentage of the time, if any, the small army was able to defeat the large army. And it turns out that 28.5% of the time, the small army, sometimes 10 times smaller than the big army, was able to defeat the big army. So it was like, whoa, how did this happen? Holy moly. So he put his magnifying glass on these exceptions, and he found that when the small army used unconventional tactics, guerrilla warfare, sort of subversive methods, the small army was able to defeat the larger army 63.6% of the time. That's almost 2/3. And for me as a serial startup founder, that really resonated. You know, as a startup founder, I'm up against the big Goliaths. I'm up against the big corporations, against the big successful startups. So enough about war, there's a story of Listerine. In the 1880s, people were bathing in a pool of bacteria, and Listerine was their go-to solution. So sales were good, but they weren't good enough for the CEO, Gordon Wheat Lambert. So what his son did is he took this Latin word halitus, which means bad breath, and then he added the cool-sounding osis to the end of it, and he created halitosis. So you no longer just had bad breath, you now had a medical condition, which could be fixed with Listerine. And he went in even further. He developed this fictional persona called Edna, and Edna was unpopular with her kids, couldn't find a man, because she had this medical condition called halitosis. And the rest is kind of history, and they became the huge brand that they are today. In my opinion, this was one of the first forms of growth hacking, subversive growth hacking. This is the baggage claim area at the Houston airport. I can't remember exactly in what year, but the Houston airport sent out a bunch of surveys asking what's the #1 complaint you have with the Houston airport. And an overwhelming majority of people said that it was the waiting time at the baggage claim area. They were waiting a whopping 9 minutes. People have really short attention spans. So what they did is they spent millions of dollars on restructuring the way that the baggage was handled, and they were able to reduce it from 9 minutes to 6 minutes. Wow, huge success. They sent out the survey again. What was the #1 complaint by people at the baggage claim area? It was the waiting time. So what did they do? A few sort of creative civil servants decided to put the arrival gates a little bit further from the baggage claim area, so that people actually had to walk 6 minutes from the baggage claim area from the arrival gates to the baggage claim area. And the complaints almost completely dropped. So next story is probably the most famous story of growth hacking of all time. You've probably heard about it. It's the story of Airbnb. So Airbnb does short-term rentals. I'm sure you all know them. And after their first year, they were kind of struggling to get a lot of users, a lot of people to rent their apartments. And they also had some competition. So what they did is they asked some of their users, where did you go before you came to Airbnb for short-term rentals? And a lot of their current users told them that they would go to Craigslist. And Craigslist had millions and millions of daily visitors looking for apartments, short-term rentals. So what the clever team at Airbnb did is they reversed engineered Craigslist so that if I had an apartment in Idaho, for example, and I put it on Airbnb, in 4 simple steps, I could actually post it directly to Craigslist with almost no friction. So almost all users who were posting their apartment on Airbnb were also posting it on Craigslist. And when somebody would come onto Craigslist and click on the Craigslist ad, they would be redirected to Airbnb. So essentially what they were doing is they were piggybacking off of the huge audience of Craigslist. They took things a little bit further. They actually scraped all of Craigslist, because Craigslist, you could contact people who had apartments by email, and then they sent them these cool little emails from Jill, Jane, saying, I absolutely love your apartment, you should come post it on Airbnb. It took about 1.5 years for Craigslist to find out what was happening, but the rest is kind of history, and they absolutely exploded. Second most famous example of all time of growth hacking is that of Dropbox. So Dropbox was a really cool product, but it was really hard to sell. It was kind of unsexy. And once they had a good product, they tried to grow it through conventional marketing methods. So one of the ones that they used was AdWords, for example, and they hired a really good performance marketeer. The problem is that it was costing them between $233 to $388 per user for a $99 product that kind of sucked. What they did have, however, was a core group of users that really loved them, and they developed a modern-day referral program. So basically, if you were to send an invitation to Dropbox to one of your friends, you would get free space, and he would get free space as well. And the results are absolutely staggering. So they went from 100,000 to 4 million users from 2008 to 2010. 2.8 million invites were sent in April of 2010 alone. And up to this date, 35% of all of their paid users, registered users, come from this referral technique. Everybody's copying this nowadays. And that's the problem with these growth hacks, is they work once, but then everybody starts copying them and they don't work as well. So I could do some more name dropping of really famous growth hacks or growth techniques, or whatever you want to call them. What do all of these have in common? The notion of OPN, other people's network. So in the real estate world, we talk about OPM, other people's money. So you're not going to buy your first house with your own money, use like the bank's money or your parents' money. Same thing in growth hacking. It's extremely difficult to build an audience. Your target audience is already hanging out on other people's networks, other people's platforms. So why don't you start by first borrowing somebody else's network or platform? So there's about, I think the last number was there's 3 billion people on the internet today, and it's actually becoming more and more easy to reach out to them. So the number of platforms are growing. This is a chart that I stole from James Courier, and it shows the viral effectiveness of customer acquisition channels over time. And it used to be, so viral channels go through 3 phases. They're born, they grow, they're big and powerful, and then they sort of die off. And the great thing is that the number of channels is actually growing exponentially over time. So what's the next big thing? What's the next big thing to get your customers? Is it one of the ones listed here? Is it one of the ones listed here? These are all pretty famous, you know, Facebook, Google, Facebook Messenger, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, all of the sort of the usual suspects. But you actually have much more. Is the next big thing Beam Social? Is the next big thing wearable technology? Is it Instagram ads that were released about a month ago? Is it self-driving cars? Is it virtual reality? Is it augmented reality? Is it Elo? Is it Slack? You know, is it designer news? Is it product hunt? You really have more and more choice to be able to tap into other people's audiences. Oh, by the way, there's a few more. And so there's a term, growth hacking is sort of disorienting sometimes, so I just want to make something clear. That growth hacking is basically, I stole this from Alistair Kroll, the guy that wrote Lean Analytics, and he says that growth hacking is 80% best practices, which people don't do in any case, but also 20% subversiveness. So most big successes, most of them, have at least a little bit of evil in them, especially in the early days. The question is, how much evil do you actually want to do? So why growth hacking? Why is it really buzzing? Why are we hearing about it? Why is it becoming so important? So companies and products, I think we talked about it with the talk just before, we have limited resources in order to grow, in order to acquire users, but more importantly, to retain them. The second reason is that traditional marketing channels, they tend to be expensive and saturated. So I really like to use this chart. This is the average US online spend to get one user up until 2012. So it's an average, so it lies, but it still shows you that it's becoming more and more expensive to grab users, to acquire users. So you have to be more and more creative and more impactful on how you drive these users to your product. And the third reason is probably the most important one. So just show of hands, who's actually working on a product here in this room? All right, so it's probably most of this room. And one of the ills of today is that people tend to focus too much on product, but actually your riskiest assumption is not building a cool product. It's a lot easier to build a cool product nowadays than it was 10 years ago. You have lean methodology, you have reduced marginal costs. What's harder is actually distribution, because everybody's building cool shit, basically, and everybody is sort of fighting for attention. Don't trust my word for it, trust these guys, Steve Blank, Peter Thiel, Dave McClure. They all agree that one of the most difficult parts of your business model canvas, or the survival of your company, is actually distribution, is actually how you can acquire new users and engage them. And I love to use this stat by the ad agencies. People are bombarded with anywhere between 250 to 3,000 ads on a daily basis. Your product, your value proposition, your app, your icon, it's just another blip in people's lives. I mean, people have like hernias, they got to get their kids out of school, their mothers are sick, and then your product is just sort of another blip. How can you have the most impact, and how can you target the right customers at the right price as cheap as possible? So the third reason is, and this is kind of one of the foundational parts of growth hacking, it's that ROI is much more important than anything else. It's much more important than branding. So the days of Madison Avenue, Mad Men ad agencies are completely gone. Working on a 6-month sort of campaign agency doesn't work anymore. We borrow from the lean methodology where we have a scientific approach to marketing and to customer acquisition. Test first, if it works, keep going. And finally, it's exciting and it's fun, and I believe it's inevitable. I've worked with a lot of companies, and I believe that we are completely dissolving the gap between product and between marketing. They are becoming one, this one thing that we call growth hacking. So what is growth hacking? I love to use this Venn diagram because it's kind of visual. And so first of all, it's creative marketing. So it's David versus Goliath, using other people's networks, thinking subversively, thinking differently than everybody else. And second of all, it's about experiments and data. So experiments, like I said, we have an experiment-based approach to marketing. An experiment-based approach to marketing, a scientific approach to marketing. And second of all, there's data. So we can test our gut feelings, or we can test things based on data that we've seen, but then we should always test it to see if it works or not, and we back that up with data. And when I talk about data, I don't just talk about hard data. Of course, there is hard data. When I talk about hard data, usually people pull this face, probably not at this conference, which is a good thing. So we like to use to turn a lot of these experiments into customer flows, for example. We use a lot of conversion funnels. We use cohort charts, predictive analysis, and a lot of A/B testing. But we also talk about soft data, because soft data is probably the most important thing, the place where you get the most insights from your customers. And soft data is talking to customers, doing surveys, doing a lot of usability testing. I often say that usability testing is like flossing. People know they should do it, people don't actually do it, and then when they actually do it, they start bleeding, so you should do it on a daily basis. And I love this quote from Eric Ries, and this basically sums it all up. Sustainable growth comes from understanding your best customers, finding out where to find more of them. And that's basically it. If you retain anything from this talk, it's probably this one. And then finally, there's automation and engineering. So I'll talk a little bit about the relationship between engineering and growth hacking in a few seconds. But basically, the notion is, in order to have speed, we need to use automation, we need to use coding, we need to use engineering. And even if somebody doesn't know how to code, there's a lot of tools out there that can enable them to take a tool off the shelf to test something without actually coding it into his or her product. So now I want to talk about some growth hacking principles, really to get it into your brains. So the first principle is, if you build something, no one will come. People don't just magically come. And I think people are really starting to come around to this. It's not just by building something awesome. A lot of people are building a lot of awesome stuff that's getting absolutely no recognition or awareness. It's only in testing that we'll know if something's going to work or not. Data levels all arguments. Data has kept me out of so many meetings. It's absolutely incredible. We only scale successes and we kill failures, so it's all about speed. There's no time for a gray area. If it doesn't work, kill it. Try maybe one more time, then kill it. If it works, double down on it. Focus, we have a lack of resources. And then test as much as possible and as fast as possible. Speed usually wins. So there's been a lot of talk about what's the difference between growth hacker and digital marketeer. Growth hacker is just digital marketeer, same wine, different bottle. Actually, it's not the case. So I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but basically, I was a digital marketeer, a full-stack marketeer for 6 years before naming myself a growth hacker. And the main difference is the growth hacker is really implanted inside the product, on the whole product funnel. And the second big difference is that the growth hacker has a really strong technical skill set, which I'll go into the next slide. So this is what a growth hacker looks like. Let's look at this 2 or 3 seconds. So first of all, you've got this base layer that the growth hacker knows about, this head of growth knows about, this programming, behavioral psychology, copywriting, analytics. He understands it, he can talk the lingo, he can actually also execute on some of it. Then you have a more even deeper foundation of this marketing foundation with A/B testing, conversion rate optimization. He's pretty strong at funnel marketing and database querying. And then there's this third layer where he's really a marketing expert on all of these marketing channels. He knows how to leverage marketing channels, find new ones, and how to use these channels. And usually, a growth hacker is really an absolute expert on 2 or 3 channels. So there's a big problem here, is that this profile is extremely rare. We call these guys unicorns. We call these guys unicorns who live in clouds. So unicorns because they basically don't exist, and they live in clouds because they're extremely hard to find, and they tend to hide. So how do we solve this as a growth hacking agency and as a growth hacking a firm? The way we solve this is we build growth hacking teams inside companies. So a growth hacking team looks like this. The first element is you've got your head of growth. He's kind kind of a risk taker, he's analytical, he's all those things that I just talked about. The head of growth's best friend is his kick-ass coder best friend. His kick-ass coder is like a full-stack coder who's not scared to build stuff that's actually going to break. He's into building stuff he's into iterating really, really quickly, and he doesn't mind putting like 2 or 3 days into his sprint planning to make sure that he can build the data analytics framework needed to be able to track the results of what we're actually doing. So their second best friend is the UX and UI designer or front-end developer. And his role is to really use behavioral psychology and have customer empathy to be able to run these experiments. And usually this type of profile is somebody who doesn't spend 6 hours on the opacity of a drop shadow for a call to action button, who just sort of ships it as fast as possible and then iterates after it's been shipped. And then finally, there's the data analyst, somebody who really understands data, both large but also small amounts of data, and who's not scared of soft data, and who's able to also find insights within that data, actionable insights. That's the most important part. So this is the sad news, is that even if you've got the team and the mentality, there's actually no secret potion, there's actually no hack, so it's actually a misnomer. There's no hack to make your next product into the next big Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, whatever product you want. But the good news is that growth hacking is maturing and we are developing a process. And the great thing about this process is it has 3 main points. First of all, it's adaptable, so it's adaptable across organizations, and it's adaptable within the organization across different departments. And second of all, it's expandable, it's scalable, so it can actually grow as the company grows. And third of all, the most important, because people are really lazy and it's extremely hard to change people's behavior, it's that it's extremely easy to implement. There's almost no friction. And this is what the process looks like. So we stole a lot of this stuff from the lean startup and the lean methodology, as well as conversion rate optimization. And basically at the top, you have like company objectives. So these can be OKRs or any type of different objectives. Then we have data insights, soft and hard data, but also gut feeling, using your fast brain and your intuition. And then we start running through these loops. So the first part of the loop, it's a brainstorm. We brainstorm ideas, we use a lot of dot voting, and we steal a lot of methodologies from the Google Design Sprint. And then second of all, you have a prioritization framework. We use a bunch of different prioritization techniques. Third of all, we design experiments with minimum success criteria, much like people do in the scientific world. Then we execute as fast as possible, and we tend to use Agile, Scrum, and sprint planning. And then the most important part is the analysis. Even if an experiment fails, you can still get learnings from that experiment, so it's actually not a failure. When something works, we build it into the product, we code it into the product, and if you can't code it into the product, we systemize it inside the company. And then we run these loops again and again and again. And I have to admit, 9 out of 10 experiments fail, but from time to time, we get these big wins, and this is what we call the growth hacks. So I work with a lot of companies, and this is what I usually see. Usually I see dev teams only working on core functionalities that respond to current customers' needs, but this is the way that I see companies changing. We're grabbing developers, taking them out of this core functionality teams that spend 90% of the time on core functionalities, and we're putting them on the acquisition team. We're putting them on the activation team. We're putting them on the referral team. We're putting them on the retention team. And then we grow so much that we can actually hire more developers to put them back into the core functionality team. And then these teams, they roll the same process again and again and again and again. So we run through these loops. And the faster we can run through these loops, the faster we get to success. So I usually get asked whether it's time for growth or not. Actually, there's 4 different types of growth. There's top-line growth, there's activation growth, there's retention growth, and there's monetization growth. These 2 are the hardest ones to nail. They're the ones that we spend the most time on, but they're the most valuable ones. But right now, I want to talk about the sexy one. I want to talk about user acquisition. There's a book called Traction Book that shows that there's only a limited color palette on how you can actually acquire users. But the thing is, this color palette isn't actually so limited. So if I narrow down into content marketing, for example, you'll see that there's also a lot of subsets of content marketing. So you've got curating a blog, infographics, making videos, ebooks, podcasts, flipboards, Pinterest pins, tweets, LinkedIn posts, Google, Instagram, Facebook, and the list goes on and on and on, so it can be sort of overwhelming, so you need a process for this too. And the process is kind of easy. So the first rule is that you should actually diversify your portfolio, because if Google changes its algorithm overnight, your SEO strategy is completely dead. And I would say find 2 or 3 channels that actually work for you and only focus on those 2 or 3 channels. We have a framework called the BRASS framework in order to determine which is the best customer customer acquisition channel to start testing. It's a mix of blink, gut feeling, relevance, product channel fit, ease, how easy is it to set up this customer acquisition channel, and finally scalability. If it works, can I actually scale it? So then when you're driving traffic to your product, to your website, to your landing page, whatever, then what do? Then comes behavioral psychology. This is James Courier from Ooga Labs. He recommends that you should spend 50% of all your resources on the first user experience, on that first experience that a user has with your product. And I'm not even talking minutes, I'm actually talking seconds. So you should be able to show the core value of your product within the first 5 seconds of a person's visit. Just like with a date, you know, that first impression really counts. And then when you're done with the first 5 seconds, you can use principles of persuasion to make sure that person signs up and actually gets to the core value of your product and understands, gets to that wow moment. What is the value that you're showing? People have the attention spans of goldfish. What are some of the best examples of user onboarding ever? They actually come from video games. So video games do this really well. I don't know if anybody plays like World of Warcraft or whatever. The first time you play, they teach you to punch, they teach you to jump, they teach you to kick. They remove all of the friction. They teach you little by little how to get to that wow moment. So once you've gotten somebody to that wow moment, how do you know if they are actually using the product? This is where we start to use hard data. Hard data is really one of the foundations of growth hacking. Hard data tells us exactly what's happening on our website, and we use things like events-based analytics, but also predictive analytics. So hard data is great, but then you can get too caught up in hard data and not really understand your users and get stuck in this sort of local maxima of optimization. So to get out of this local maxima, we use soft data. And soft data is basically talking to your products and doing usability testing. There's no excuse to not talk to at least one customer every single day. So then what do we do with these hypotheses? Well, we do conversion rate optimization. We do a lot of A/B testing, and there's so much that you can A/B test. Sign-up forms, you can A/B test landing pages, you can A/B test product pages, you can A/B test referral pages. There's so much to choose from that you also need a framework for this. And now what? So as a growth hacking agency, we started to get a lot of requests for actual growth hackers. So this is data pulled off of AngelList, and you see that the #1 requested skill in marketing is actually growth hacking. And so this is Amsterdam in the Startup Ecosystem Report of 2015. I thought this was pretty cool. Amsterdam finally made it into the top 20. One of the big ones that they're struggling with is actually talent, and we were having this problem too. I get about 40 or 50 requests per month for a good growth hacker or a technical marketeer. The problem is that the ratio is 7:1. There's only 18,000 proclaimed growth hackers for about 120 or 130,000 open positions. So our solution for this was to stop with the consulting or continue with the consulting, but to also build what we call the Growth Tribe Academy, where we're going to teach people this skill set. And the point of the Growth Tribe Academy is to make people ready to join teams, the type of teams that are being used by these companies: Facebook, Spotify, LinkedIn, Quora, Twitter, and there's many, many more. So the difficulty is, how do we train people to do this in a 3-month period? How do we train people to go through our whole curriculum and learn all of these skills in only 3 months? The solution for this was that we would put them in actual growth projects, in actual startups, and we're only going to teach them what they need to know. So this is UX, this is everything you could learn about UX, but we're only going to be teaching you this specific thought. We've also signed up with really strong partners to build credibility, but also to have help on the public side and on the private side. For example, we've partnered up with Katawiki, which is one of the fastest growing startups here in the Netherlands. And we've just launched our Growth Tribe Academy. So if anybody's interested in this, I'd really ask you to go check out our website, growthtribeacademy.com, where we're sort of building the future of education, bridging the gap between product development and marketing. And I'd just like to stop with one of the quotes from our applicants. And he says that education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And growth hacking, it's the second. Thank you very much.